So now we have this part here, we're ready to go and create the discs. So they're basically just cylinders or discs in shape, and we're only going to create one and then mirror it over to the other side. So the easiest way to do that is just to append, and we can just choose to append a disc, a circle 3D here, or a cylinder, whichever. I'm going to take the circle 3D. When you click on that, if it doesn't appear in the viewport, it may be because you're just looking at it from a different angle. So as you rotate around, you can see from the front view is basically where it's going to show this, but we had been looking from the top view. I'm going to press Shift F so we can see what's going on, and I'm going to select the cylinder here, and I'm just going to hide that initial torque after I've scaled this to roughly the right size. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to hit W, I'm going to look at it from the side view, and I'm going to, holding down Shift, constrain this to 5-degree angle increments as I rotate this around to 90 degrees, and you'll see 90 written down here. So when I get to 90, I know I'm good. I'll press Shift as I'm snapping to a top view, and I'm going to grab this middle one and just kind of scale it down here to roughly the right size that I want. So something like this will be fine for what we're going to do. We can always modify the scale at a later date. I'm going to hide the original torque band here and just focus on the disc. So with this disc, there's probably about 50 ways you can make this. So I'm just going to go over 2 ways, one that involves alphas and one that doesn't. And I'll just show you the advantages and disadvantages of both. So the first thing we want to do is create this kind of lift. There's this part here is flat, and then it lifts up to the sides here. So the easiest way to do that is to hover over an edge. If insert single edge loop is turned on, we can just hold down Alt and remove that edge. And I'm going to remove this one here as well, and this one, and maybe this one. Actually, I'll remove this and this. So this is roughly where that location is there. If it's not, you just insert a new one, hold down Alt and remove until you get to the right location. Effectively, I just want to move this outside edge up. So the easiest way to do that is if I hover over an edge and I choose Transpose Edge Loop Complete, then I can click on an edge and that will basically mask everything except for that edge loop. So if I now go to a front viewport, I tend to always just hold down Alt and just click on my gizmo just to recenter it to the world. So when I'm lifting this up, I know it's going to be centered. It's going to go straight up. So now we have that kind of lifted edge here. We can get rid of our mask here. So if I press Q to go back into draw mode, we're now ready to start sculpting on this. So it can be tempting in geometry to just go and hit divide and divide and divide. And you can see that it immediately shrinks the whole object quite dramatically. If you turn on dynamic subdivision, with this it'll also shrink the subject. But with dynamic, what you can do is you can turn on creasing to prevent that from happening. So if you go down to the crease here, we can just hit the crease button and then hit dynamic again. And you can see that that maintains those edges there. That creasing didn't work on the center here, these edges here. I'm going to turn dynamic off for a second. So we can hover over these edges and choose crease edge loop complete and click on that to crease that as well. We could have also done the same with this outside. So now when I press D to turn on dynamic, I'm going to change this to say always yes, as I'm going to be pressing D and Shift D to turn on and off dynamic quite a lot, and I don't want to be annoyed by that message. So now you can see that we've maintained the original shape quite well here. So when you're sculpting, you can look at this and say, well, actually these are quite long and elongated. If I actually wanted the geometry to be evenly dispersed across this, what I can do is I can go to Insert, Multiple Edge Loops, and I can click on one of these and just drag out until I start making these fairly evenly distributed again. I'm going to press Ctrl W just to get rid of that, and you can see as soon as I do that, all this creasing has been introduced. So we can go back to our creasing and we can just turn that off, uncrease all, and go back to hitting crease. This angle here is probably quite low, so we could just automatically get that by bringing this angle down and then hitting crease again, and it'll find that change in angle there and say, okay, well that's at that 15-degree threshold. So we now have our model again. We have evenly distributed polygons. We say, okay, right, we're almost ready to sculpt, to start putting in these details around here. I'm going to press Z and just zoom in here a little bit. These are effectively just little balls, and these are little discs that seem to be carved either into or out of. I'm not quite sure, it's hard to see. But so what we're going to do is just, if we wanted to insert those balls here, it can be very tempting to just say, well, I'm going to, before I do that, give it some depth. So I'm going to press Shift E to turn it off. So we can give it depth by just deciding to Q mesh, polygroup all, and pushing this out. That will give it some depth. So the next time we press D for dynamic, we can see we now have some thickness to this. This dynamic subdivision, if we apply this to make it into real subdivisions, we're going to be changing from 450 polygons. This is just previewing what it would look like if it was smoothed twice. So I'm going to apply that, and we've gone up to 7,000 polygons, and we can continue to divide that up to 29, 100, 400,000, nearly 2 million, for example. I'll press Shift F to turn this off. So the first method we're going to look at is using alphas, which is my least preferred method just because it relies on a lot of density of geometry, which you don't necessarily always want to do for small pieces. But let's go through and see what we can do with that. So we have 1.86 million polygons on this, which allows us to do an awful lot. First thing I'd say before you go any further, in your brush under samples, the fourth roll up here, just make sure spotlight projection is turned off if you're using a spotlight projection as we are here. So if you're not using one, this won't matter, but if you are, you'll have to turn that off or you won't be able to sculpt on your object like this. You can see right now we have X symmetry turned on, so I actually want this to be radial symmetry. So I'll go up to my transform menu here, and I've taken these options here and I basically put them here on my interface just for easier access. So effectively anytime I access these, what I'm really accessing is this. So the first thing we want to do is we want to change to radial symmetry, and radial symmetry will give us 12 options for what we're actually going to do here. So I'm going to keep that for a start. That's okay, but it's looking at the wrong axis. So in ZBrush, because we're looking from the top down, we need to go with the Y axis. So I'm going to turn off the X, I'm going to turn on the Y, and now you can see I can sculpt and I get that radially sculpting. The maximum you can use in ZBrush is 100. You can try and type in 200, it's just going to revert back to 100. There's nothing else you can do there. So we have a standard brush selected here, and if I start sculpting, you can see we get this kind of round shape here. And I can add another one in between, and now I'm getting those little dots that we see over there. We can change to a dam standard with BDS, and from that we can just kind of draw a line on either side of that, and now we're getting that shape. And we can do the same down here, maybe a better line than I'm drawing here, and change back to our standard BSU and put our dots back in there as well. So these are those finicky details. I've maybe made mine a little bit bigger than they should be, or a little bit smaller than they should be, but you get the idea. You can do that. This isn't going to hold up to close inspection. It is 1.8 million polygons and it's still a bit blurry when you get in close, but it's possible. And we're going to look at doing the 12 discs here. So I'm just going to take my radial symmetry down to 12 and hit enter. And you'll see we now get 12 of these. So if I try and sculpt on this, you can see it is sculpting, but that's not the shape that we want. What we want to do is actually drag a stroke out onto this. So I'm going to change to the drag rect stroke type. And you can see now when I drag out, we get this soft shape. So that's obviously not what we're looking for. You could choose a square alpha, like alpha 14 here, for example, and click on this, and then you'd expect it to be square, and it's not really doing it for you. That's because of our focal shift. Our focal shift right now is set to 0, so we want to set this to -100 in order for us to get sharp edges. And now I can click anywhere on here, and you can see we're going to get a really sharp edge. This is still kind of, a little bit faceted. I can hold down Alt if I want to push it in. But you see, no matter what, we're getting this kind of blurry, faceted look here. So there's not a lot we can do to fix that. We can try go down to deformation down here, and we can try and do something like polish by features, just dial it up a little bit. But it's still, all it's doing is blurring out these circles and blurring out these details that we actually had up here. So this isn't my preferred way of doing things. I would much prefer to work, if I'm going to use 1.8 million polygons or thereabouts, well then I want crisp details everywhere. So let's go over the second approach to this. So I'm just going to undo everything that we've done here up to this point where we had our geometry. So the method we're going to use now doesn't actually need subdivision. So you can see we currently have 7. That's quite dense. It's 1.8 million polygons, as we said. But if I was to go down the subdivisions down to, say, 4, for example, we have 29,000. And I don't really see this silhouette breaking up much. So I'm going to go with this. So I'm going to delete the higher subdivisions and delete the lower, just so I can work on as low as possible a shape. So this time we're actually going to use live Boolean so we can cut some shapes out of this. So right now we currently only have one subtool here, that's it. So if I want to insert these details, I can actually insert these as geometry rather than as alphas. And this is the radically different approach to take. So we can say we want to insert 100, so I have this 100 set here, but we're still on a brush like this. So we want to insert geometry. You press B, I, and we have two options here for this one. We have the insert primitives, where we can insert spheres, or we could insert hemispheres, and that's what the H in IMM primitives H stands for hemisphere, or half rather. So now we have this option. I can click on here and I can choose and insert hemisphere here. So now when I go in close, because we don't have subdivisions, I can press shift so we can see this at the same time. I have no subdivisions here, which means I can now click on this and make these as large as I want. Now you'll see when you click and drag that these become a certain size. If I have a very specific size in mind, I can undo that. I can make the brush the size that I want. And now when I click and drag, it will continue to make them whatever size. But if I press Control while I'm dragging that out, so click first and then hold down Control, it will limit their size to whatever size my brush was. So I can now do that again, and now we have double the amount here. I'll Control drag to get rid of my mask. And if I try and do that down here, obviously it's a smaller circle, so I won't need to do it twice because they're going to be closer together. If you needed to change that value to a value that suits you, just change your radial count to something that works for you. There appear to be ridges on either side of these, and I'm not quite sure whether they're pushing out or pushing in, but let's just go with one. So I'm going to get rid of this mask here. I'm going to press Shift F so we can see what's going on here. And I actually want to create a ridge on either side of these here. So what I'm going to do is go back to my Z modeler brush, BZM, and if I hover over an edge, I have the option to insert an edge loop. Now if symmetry is still turned on, it's going to have a problem. So I'll turn that off by hitting X. And now I can click and create an edge loop there, and I can click and create an edge loop there. Once I've done that, now I want to actually take all of these edges in these two rows here and basically push them down or up, depending on what you're looking for. If you're not happy with one of these, just hold down Alt and click on one, and then just place it again by drawing again. So the way these works, the way we're actually going to push this stuff down, is we're going to hover over a mesh. We're going to choose our Z modeler brush. We'll choose Q mesh, and instead of a single poly, which is the default action, we're going to choose a poly loop. So if I do that, the way a poly loop works is that it will look in the direction that this orange line is pointing. If I'm going up and down with this orange line, well then it will choose these polygons. If I'm going left or right, then it will choose these polygons. And that's what I want to do. I want to go all the way around my circle with these and insert them, or inset them. So I'm going to make sure that my line is pointing in that direction. I'm going to click and I'm going to push down. If you wanted this up, obviously you would push in the opposite direction. If you had a previous selection, you'll see, if I undo that, because this was white, it's going to take this as well, because this would get added to a selection. So just hold down Alt to get rid of that if you do have any. Now we can just click on a loop and push it down. And if we want this to be the same depth, all we have to do is click one more time and it will make it the same depth. If we want to preview that, we can press D for dynamic and see what that will look like. Shift F will actually turn that off. So this is a much cleaner way to actually do this. I'm going to press Shift D to turn that off again, and I'm going to create new loops over here, and I'm going to just click to give myself the same depth as I had on the previous two. Zoom out, press D for dynamic, and now you can see we have this lovely clean, super clean look to this. We don't have the 12 pieces here, so we're going to have to make them as well. So I'm going to go back to an insert mesh brush, B, I, and I'm going to choose this time I'm going to choose a primitives, and I'm going to choose the first cylinder that I see here. I'm going to press X to turn on symmetry. I don't need 100 of these, I just need 12, so I'm just going to change to 12 and hit enter. And now you can see when I hover over this I get 12. So I can click somewhere around the middle, click and drag until, and I'm looking at the base of where these actually intersect with the circle here. So these aren't quite close enough. Let me just do that one more time. So something like that I think will do. This works for me. So right now these are still part of that same subtool. This hasn't changed. This is all one tool. That's just masked out the original object. So if we want to split that, we'll have to go to our split menu here and say split unmasked points. That's going to take those cylinders and make them a separate object. We can view one on its own by turning off the other one and saying, well, that's what this looks like. Shift F will show us the polygons for that, or the wireframe rather. So these two, we're going to actually cut this out of this object here. And the way we do that in ZBrush is by using something called live Boolean. So you can turn live Boolean on here. I'll press Shift F to turn this off, and it's not going to appear to do anything, but that's because we haven't actually specified what actually has to happen. So the way live Boolean works is it looks at the top of the stack and reads its way down. So we have to define where the top of that stack is. And we do that by clicking this little arrow here. We're basically saying start from here and then do live Boolean on the objects below it. This one is currently being added. If we change this to subtract, it's going to subtract them. If we want to see the intersection between them, we can change it to this. If we had another subtool, we could add that or subtract that or do whatever we like, but it will basically start from here and work its way down. I like to put these into a folder. I'm just going to explain why. If I put a folder here and I just call this bool or something like that, we can click and we can drag this and you'll see that teal line. I don't want to put it up here. I want to put it down here below this so the stack remains in the same order. This allows us to perform Boolean operations on a folder, which is actually quite handy. So right now you can see with live Boolean turned on, these cylinders are starting to cut through this object here, but I want to modify them slightly. So if I click on the object, something changes, but I don't see how I'm actually modifying it. If I press Shift F, it will actually show me those original objects, because right now it's just a preview. Live Boolean will toggle that on and off. If I press Shift F, live Boolean is toggling that on and off. But if I want to see what they're doing, but also be able to see them, I'll have to turn on live Boolean and press Shift F to see where those objects are. If I press W, when we drew them on, the normals, it was facing in the right direction. So this cone is going to allow me to push this in and out. And you can see what's happening there. It's pushing it in and out. Well, basically all we're doing is we're moving these cylinders in through this. I can now press Shift F so you understand what's going on. If I'm not happy with the location, for example, these are intersecting each other, I can scale them down. If I scale them down, they're going to scale uniformly, but because this is still looking at the right angle, I can just press the green and I'll press Shift F so we can actually see what's going on here. And now I can push them down with the blue. So I'm basically pushing them away from each other by scaling them down and then pushing them up, if that makes sense. Something like that. So find the distance that you like or draw them out again if that's the case. Press W anytime you want to move them. We can change our depth, but you can see that they're quite faceted here on the inside. And the reason for that faceted look is if I turn live Boolean off, it's because these are actually faceted cylinders. So there is an easy way to fix that. I'm going to turn off the original object and I'll just turn on our cylinders. And normally with this, all I would actually do is I'll go down to geometry and I'll turn on dynamic subdivision. So if I turn this on, you can see it's now smoothing them out. But we're getting this kind of scalloping effect here. And maybe the subdivisions need to be increased. We can go up to 4. And you can see it's smoothing out the sides of this, but it's not really smoothing out the scalloped edges here. The result of that, if we don't actually fix this, if I turn this back on and I turn on live Boolean, is that while the sides are smooth here, the scalloping will remain. So we do need to fix that. And also it looks like there's lots of little ridges in here as well. So we kind of want to address that while we're here. So I'm going to turn live Boolean off. I'm going to hide the original object. I'll just have our cylinders and I'll go back around here and let's have a look at what we can do. So I'm going to press Shift D to turn off dynamic. All that's doing is basically toggling this off. And I'm going to change back to a Z model brush, B, Z, M. And then from here, we can hover over an edge and we can start inserting loops here if we want to. And even just this amount, if I turn on dynamic subdivision, is going to remove that scalloping. You see the way it's totally cleared that up. But I want to actually create those ridges, and whatever this shape is, that's what's going to get cut out. So this is an opportunity for me to actually create those ridges in this object in order to cut them out of the other object. So I'll just undo creating these two loops, and this time I'll hover over one and I'll say insert multi-edge loops, and I'll click and I'll drag until I get a few different ridges like this. You can see it automatically gives us different polygroups, which is awesome. Because what we can do now, instead of using QMesh polyloop and pushing in one and then clicking on each one in turn, we can say QMesh and then change it from polyloop to polygroup all, and that will allow us to push all of these in one go. And you can see now if I press D, we're going to get these kind of soft ridges in here. If you wanted these to be hard ridges, what we could do is just crease polygroups. Just by hitting this button, crease polygroups is going to make them hard. But if you want them to be soft, I'll just undo that. Let's make them soft for the moment. You can see now we have that detail. So I'll go back in here, I'll turn on our object, I'll turn on live Boolean, and now you see we're getting that kind of nice engraved effect in here on these as well. Again, if you wanted them hard, just turn that on. This right now is still 25,000 polygons, or rather if I select our original object, it's 270,000 polygons because we've added on all these little cylinders. This would work for a render. If you just wanted to render this in your object, that would be fine. You could do that. You could throw your gold material on it. You could do whatever. call it done. We can actually add in a cone in here in the center of our object here. So on this object, let's just add a cone. So I'm just going to, again, the easiest and quickest way to do this for me is I'll turn off symmetry because I don't really need that. I'll press Shift F. I'll turn off live Boolean, in fact. I know I want it here in the center of my object, so I'll press B, I, and I'll choose Insert Primitive. I'll select that same cylinder. I'll click and drag one out to the size that I want. Let's say something like this. This obviously isn't tapered, but if I press W, we're going to go back into this mode here. Because this already knows what way we dragged it in, all I have to do is hit this little cog icon, and we can either change it to a cone, which would work, or if we wanted to, we could use a taper, this taper here. So right now I'll accept the cone, and I'll press W again to get out of that, and Q. So now we've added that little detail there. If I turn it back on my live Boolean, that's not affected by this other stuff. So that will be enough for me to render this. If I don't like the size of this, I can scale it up, and I can squash it down, make it whatever shape, and I can even press D for dynamic on this if I wanted to. And as a matter of fact, because I am actually going to use dynamic subdivision on this anyway, I might as well just leave it on that and get rid of our mask. If I didn't have enough, if there is a little bit of scalloping going on here again, I'll press Shift F. I'll turn off live Boolean while I'm doing this, and again I can hover over and I can insert multiple edge loops and just insert a couple in here, or a few, just to get rid of the worst of that scalloping effect. So when we press D, we get a nice clean version there as well. So D for dynamic. So again, I'll turn this on. Like I said, this could be used as a render, but if you wanted to 3D print this, this isn't going to work. Actually, our cone is maybe a little bit too big. I'm going to turn off live Boolean. I'm going to select my cone here, and again, the easiest way to do this is to just go down to polygroups and say auto groups. That will give everything that's a separate object its own group, which means I can press W and I can control tap on a vertex on this, and I can just scale it down and then move it back into place. Press D for dynamic, get rid of my mask. So now we fixed that. So this would work, but if, like I said, for a 3D print, it's not going to work. So what we're going to have to do is actually create this Boolean. So normally for a Boolean, I'll go down here, I'll have to turn on dynamic subdiv and say make Boolean mesh, and that will create a new Boolean and put it into a separate subtool. I don't necessarily want that. I want that to be here where I have my torque. So from the advantage of having the folder is that I can click on the cog icon here and say Boolean with subdiv. And that means it will actually create the Boolean and put it here in this folder, and not create another tool, which I then have to append back into this one. So having it here immediately is a great convenience. It means I can avoid using this one and use this instead. So we have 271,000 polygons. Because we have dynamic, we're actually making this a lot, we're increasing this a lot. So the final result is actually going to be a lot denser. And you can see it looks like there's a lot of confusion going on, but that's because ZBrush will always show you a tool, even if the eye icon is off, if it's selected. So I'm just going to go down and select our new tool, and we can collapse this folder. You can see that we now have 9 million polygons on this. It's really dense, but man, is it clean. It's really super clean. And if you want to reduce the polygon count from here, you can go to plugins and you can go to decimation master. We can pre-process that. What that's going to do is look at that object and say, well, what areas are flat in it, what areas require definition or extra polygons, and it'll write this all out to a file, and then allow us to decimate this with using as few polygons as necessary to maintain the shapes that we already have in here. So this will take a little while to run. So that took nearly 2 minutes, but now that it's done, I can just go over here and I can say decimate current, and it's going to take this 20% value and decimate down from 9.4 million polygons down to 1.8. And you'll see no discernible difference in the mesh here. It looks super clean still, but this is what's actually happened to it underneath the hood. If you need it lower again, you can just dial this number down. Let's put in, say, 10%, decimate it again, and now we have one at 900,000 polygons, and you can see still super clean and everything is looking nice. So yeah, that's how I go about making my torque. I'll turn this one back on. We can change back to our gold material if we want. I'm going to select this object that we have here, and I'll move it up into place. And now it's just a case of rotating it and basically placing it wherever it needs to be. And because this doesn't have subdivisions on it, we can just go to our geometry, modify topology, and say mirror and weld. And now we're going to get it on the other side too. And that's how we actually make our torque. If you want to put on additional details on that, just use metal brushes or whatever, like, to add additional details to that. If your subdivisions are looking a little bit faceted here, just go to your dynamic subdivisions and increase that to 3 or 4, just to clean that up as well. So apologies for the delay in this tutorial. I know I said it was coming a long time ago and it took me a long time to get around to it, but hopefully it helps you out on your own projects. And again, as usual, if you like this kind of content, click like, subscribe, and do all the other usual YouTube stuff. Alright, cheers, bye.